everybody, and welcome to another episode of Mental Architecture, Building the Mind One Moment at a Time. I'm Howard Blumenfeld, and this show is based off of the book Mental Architecture, which is available on Amazon, but make sure you type in the entire thing, or just type my name in, or go to www.thementalarchitect.com, and you can get my book through links in there. So today I want to continue on talking about No Normal, Chapter 5. And the section that I'm going to talk about today is understanding intelligence. And this is a really big section. What does it mean for someone to be smart or intelligent? I think we all have our own ideas of what that means. And I think our ideas are oversimplified, because if we take a broader look at intelligence, we'll find that it's a lot bigger and a lot more diverse than we might originally think. It's more than just being book smart. It's more than being people smart. There's a lot of different components to it, and researchers have been trying to understand it for centuries. So I wanted to share with you some of the more modern research about intelligence, and then let you make your mind up of what you think intelligence is. So a developmental psychologist by the name of Howard Gardner came up with an idea called multiple intelligences theory. And what this attempted to do was to break down intelligence into different categories and dimensions based on what a person was good at. And I think this was kind of represented an important shift away just from your arcane view of intelligence, where someone's just smart because they can figure puzzles out or something like that. So I want to go through each of these types briefly with you. You can read more about it in my book, but the first kind of intelligence is called naturalist intelligence. And so what naturalist intelligence is fluidity and familiarity with and comfort with things in the natural world. So this could be plants. Like, for instance, somebody who cooks could have very high naturalist intelligence because they're aware of the different scents and smells and combinations of food ingredients that go together really well when they cook a dish, versus somebody who maybe doesn't have a high naturalist intelligence. They might, try to cook something and it comes out completely wrong because they don't have a good sense of how those ingredients go together. Gardening is another perfect example. I personally am terrible at it. I don't have a green thumb, but some people do, and they're very in touch with their plants and gardens' needs. Musical intelligence is another type of intelligence that Howard talks about, and that is basically, quantified as people who have a very high sense for sounds. They can hear things and pick up on certain rhythms and nuances auditorily that other people can't. And so often you'll see these people strumming away with their guitars or playing a musical instrument. So they have a deep sense of rhythm in them. And again, this is an area where I feel like I'm kind of not so great. I do have a sense of rhythm, certainly when it comes to listening to songs and things like that. But when it comes to playing, I find myself to be pretty uncoordinated. How about you? Probably the intelligence that you're most familiar with is what Gardner refers to as logical mathematical intelligence. When people think of others being smart, I think this is often what most people go to. So these would be people who are good at solving mathematical puzzles, problems, people who computer program. Any kind of pattern recognition skills, I think, would fit into this kind of intelligence. And this is something that I've definitely been good at for a long time, although I'm not good at all kinds of logical puzzles, only certain kinds of ones. But I find that definitely a comfort in that. And I think that this type of intelligence is given way too much credit compared to some of the other ones. People who have existential intelligence are big picture thinkers. And these are people who you often see as CEOs of companies or other kinds of managers, project managers. They know how to pull people together into groups and how to organize them in the best and most efficient way so that everybody gets the most work done and feels the happiest doing it. So the existential kind of, the name existential, I think, just has to do with the fact that this is an intelligence based on pulling together non-tangible kind of resources. I mean, you're pulling people together and you're pulling their minds together. So it's not really a tangible thing, but you see something in these people that you create into something new and you call into existence, which is this group that they can work well together. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence is an intelligence characterized by the ability to be in touch with your body so that you can make very fluid technical movements that are required in things like, advanced sports, weightlifting, gymnastics, that kind of stuff. people have to have a high mind-body connection. They need to have a well-developed connection between their brain and their body so that they can move their body accordingly. So these people tend to not be very injury prone. They know what they need to do to get their bodies charged. And you tend to find them as professional athletes or athletic coaches, or, working in other bodily kinesthetic fields, very physical jobs like construction, for instance. Gardner's next type of intelligence is linguistic intelligence, which is the ability to manipulate, comprehend, and produce written and oral language. So people with high linguistic skills are great at reading, writing, and also critically analyzing pieces of written work. And this is a similar intelligence to musical intelligence, in my opinion. Both involve similar kinds of skill sets. It's just music is a language that is a little more universal than, English, for instance, although English doesn't have to be the language for linguistic intelligence. And I feel like this is an area personally, along with some of the other ones I mentioned prior to this, that I feel that I'm pretty good at myself. So you can already see that in Gardner's intelligence model, you're not confined to one type of intelligence or another. It's really about whatever. It's almost like a little spectrum of these different intelligences, whichever ones kind of match you best. And so, you can be different kinds for sure. Another type of intelligence is intrapersonal intelligence. And this goes along with people being able to be very intuitive and empathetic with others, have a deep understanding of their own thoughts and feelings, and just be very connected with themselves. So they're guided by a sense of higher purpose and self when they make decisions, and they can empathize with the struggles of others because they're able to put themselves in other people's shoes. The last type of intelligence is called spatial intelligence, and this is similar to mathematical intelligence, the one from earlier, the logical one, but a little bit different. So this one is more about being able to visualize patterns in space. And if you think of like engineering or anything like that, where you've got to piece things together and really understand how different components fit and how that affects their form and function, I think it's more like the geometry side to the logical mathematical. They're related to each other. And certainly you can have people who excel at both. When I was in college studying math, geometry was my weakest math subject. I was much more strong with just the pure logic, and the stuff that you actually couldn't visualize and the stuff you could visualize, which was very different than my peers. Most of my peers were the other way around. Gardner's different view of intelligence certainly is refreshing. It's not validated by any scientific research. And most of the criticism is focused on it just being too aptitude and skills based. If you notice, most of the intelligence was all about having some kind of skill. And we know from more modern intelligence research that there's more to it than that. So I'd like to discuss some of the more, recent and more holistic types of intelligence that have been developed since those times and built upon Gardner's intelligence theories, which were a good foundation for further research. General intelligence model, which is known as G theory, is based off of an individual's working memory, frontal lobe function, and other genetic and hereditary factors. And it's more closely related to their ability to process, store, and interpret information. And it's similar to the idea behind the IQ test or the intelligence quotient, which there's actually multiple versions of that too. With generalist intelligence, it doesn't break it down into the categories that Gardner did. But, Gardner did come along and try to adapt his model to the more kind of generalist view. And he came up with the idea of mental searchlight function and something called the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. But this was more of just kind of like a general place in the brain that stored all these things. So very kind of holistic view to everything, kind of more in line with this approach called G theory. Now, one of the major criticisms of Gardner's theories is he assumes that intelligence, those different forms of intelligence, occur in specific regions of the brain only. But further research done by a researcher by the name of Lynn Waterhouse showed that very much is not the case, and that intelligence occurs all throughout the brain. And, the intelligence for music and intelligence for linguistic skills and those other types that Howard talked about, or Gardner talked about, they're spread all throughout the brain in different areas. So you can't just point to one area of the brain and say that's exactly where something occurs. It's more complicated than that. Neural networks are a lot more intricate and interconnected, and they're just not that simple. So, what's really interesting, though, is that when Gardner went to this CIA model, he actually kind of validated the G theory of intelligence without really intending to do so. His entire approach was to discredit the idea of IQ and working memory as being responsible for intelligence. But in his later research, he kind of accidentally ended up validating those things. And the research that came afterwards invalidated a lot of his ideas in terms of just, like I said, that intelligence can be pigeonholed in one place or another in the brain. So for Lynn Waterhouse, intelligence is all about making decisions. And she breaks this up into two different categories: intuitive intelligence and deliberative intelligence. So intuitive intelligence is just the kind of intelligence that you don't really think about when you're going about your daily life. It's just you're relying on intuition, making very quick decisions. It could be as simple as what you're deciding to eat for lunch, or where you're deciding to drive your car, which road you're going to go on, what route you're going to take. It's just very quick, instinctive decisions. Deliberative intelligence is more of the thoughtful, logical reasoning. If you're going to be writing a paper, if you're going to be doing research, that kind of intelligence. So she really just breaks it down kind of in those two areas. And you might think that she's oversimplifying things, but that's just what she sees based on her research. And there's another idea called that adaptive cognition theory. And what this claims is that basically our intelligence has evolved to help us deal with problems in the natural world. So one example of this is the mirror neuron system. These are neurons in your brain that are basically tasked with mimicking and copying what you observe and then repeating those behaviors in yourself. And we see this not only in humans, but in animals as well. So there's actually a whole body of research on social cheating. And, this goes beyond just the pencil and paper or computer cheating that students do in their classes, but just the idea of cheating, taking something away from somebody or something else, or someone or another animal that's not yours. And there's neurons that basically are adapted to that kind of behavior that have evolved over millennia to cope with the problems of survival. So that's, again, adaptive cognition theory, just one of many intelligence theories out there. Not only are there regions in the brain responsible for cheating, but there's also regions of the brain responsible for detecting that cheating. So these networks build upon each other. They're very fluid, and they change depending on what the needs of the species are over time. What are the survival needs of the species? And that will determine kind of what form the brain takes in this adapted model. So moving a little bit away from the ideas of intellectual intelligence, I want to talk to you about a different kind of intelligence that many of you have probably thrown around, which is the idea that someone can be very emotionally intelligent. And that idea of emotional intelligence is actually credited to a guy by the name of Daniel Goleman. And he is sort of seen as a leading authority of emotional intelligence. And he broke emotional intelligence down into four general categories, and those are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. Now, if you really want to get into the weeds on emotional intelligence, kind of like we did earlier with the multiple intelligence theory of Howard Gardner, then you'll need to read my book because it just gets into a lot of detail. But to sum it up, emotional intelligence theory was developed to predict what kind of people would make good leaders and problem solvers in the workplace, where interpersonal relationship skills are extremely important. And so all kinds of different tests over the past few decades have been developed to try to address the idea of emotional intelligence. And there's things such as the Myers-Solovey-Caruso emotional intelligence test, or the MSCEIT, the Barron emotional quotient. I feel if I talk about all these, this video would end up being really, really long, and I don't want to make these videos too long. So you can read about those in my book, but what's really interesting is here is another researcher trying to come up with an emotional intelligence theory. And then guess what? Lynn Waterhouse comes back around and discredits it. I mean, she wasn't being mean about it, but basically shows that emotional intelligence theories are also too oversimplified. So Waterhouse's main criticism was that there's no neurological evidence that there's an emotional processing part of the brain. She actually sees emotional intelligence as just a different kind of intellectual intelligence. And I'd like to share a quote with you from her. She said, basic social attachment in all mammals depends on a system of the hormones oxytocin, vasopressin, and vasopressin operating in brain-body circuits. And then I wrote after that, just as is the case with mirror neuron systems, human brains have evolved complex circuitry to process emotional information, including having empathy, recognizing facial expressions and body language, and communicating with social cues. Another thing to consider is that people process emotions differently. Not everybody uses language to process or express them. And so to have a really good emotional intelligence theory, you also need to incorporate personality theories and types. And so if you think back to an earlier chapter, I mentioned the big 5 personality traits, and these are common all throughout psychology, and that would be warmth, conscientiousness, sociability, neuroticism, and openness. So those 5 traits are kind of general traits covering a range of personalities. You combine that with the way a person's brain functions, and you get a type of emotional intelligence that's actually quite intellectual. Just depends on how the person prefers to express and how they were raised, and also just their genetics. I think that can all play into how they express emotions. It's really difficult to quantify that in with a score. And that's what a lot of researchers tried to do. And I think that's flawed. And I think Waterhouse also would agree with that it's a flawed way to do it. But you can definitely talk about people's emotional intelligence as long as you're honoring that everybody has some of that to one degree or another. It's just they express it a little bit differently. And there's certainly a spectrum of emotional intelligence and of different types of emotional intelligence, different ways of expressing feelings and communicating with others, sometimes through words, sometimes through gestures, sometimes through a hug. All these different ways use different parts of the brain, and they could be considered forms of emotional intelligence. It's really just not simple and clear cut and as straightforward as logical, mathematical kinds of intelligence. But the interesting thing is when you take a step back and you look at it from a holistic level, both types of intelligence have the same thing in common, which is they're using regions of the brain to compute, process, and act out the results of those computations, whether they're about people or not, still intelligence. I think it's important to be sensitive to the fact that there's different types of intelligence, and there really isn't a whole lot of use to measuring people's intelligence. I think all it does is make people feel really bad about themselves if they don't score well, or feel a little cocky if they score extremely well. Intelligence is not one-dimensional. And intelligence doesn't occur in just one region of the brain. Even if we try to differentiate intelligence into a bunch of different kinds, we can't just say that one intelligence occurs here, another occurs there, another occurs there. It just doesn't work like that. Intelligence really boils down to an overall functioning of the brain, along with personality traits. And it's very fluid, very dynamic, and a person's intelligence can change over time. And their intelligence can express itself through their interactions with others or through their interactions with tangible objects and abstract ideas. And we should recognize all of those as being valuable. The more valuable somebody feels, the more likely they're going to want to make contributions to society. So that's understanding intelligence. I don't claim to understand all of it, but I really feel like we should look at it in a more broad sense and not in such a strict quotient-based, score-based view. So thank you for joining me for another episode of Mental Architecture. And if you want to see more videos like this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Ring the bell to be notified of future videos. We got one more video to go for chapter 5 and then onward to chapter 6. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great day.